I heard the chainsaws before I saw them. It was a Saturday morning, and I was halfway through my second coffee when the buzzing started. I stepped out onto my porch in nothing but basketball shorts and a faded t-shirt, expecting to see a neighbor trimming a hedge. Instead, I saw two guys in neon vests standing next to the towering sycamore in my front yard, my tree revving up for another cut. "Hey," I shouted, already halfway down the driveway. "What the hell are you doing?" One of the guys looked up, surprised. "HOA work order, sir. We were told to remove it." "The hell you were," I snapped. "Who signed off on this?" He shrugged and pointed toward the street, where a silver SUV was idling. That's when I saw her, Clorinda Goodman, head of the HOA and self-appointed neighborhood dictator. She rolled down the window with that stiff little head tilt she always did when she knew she was about to say something utterly ridiculous. "Morning, Everett," she said, voice dripping with fake sweetness. "You should be thanking me. That tree was a liability." Roots were creeping too close to the sidewalk. "That tree's 50 years old," I said, walking up to her window. "It's never caused a problem. You didn't even notify me." She waved a clipboard. "It's outlined in Section 12, Paragraph C of the Community Vegetation Guidelines. The HOA has discretion to mitigate potential hazards." I laughed. "Oh, so now it's a potential hazard? You mean to tell me you didn't like how it blocked your view of the street from your little garden bench, so you had it cut down?" Clorinda's smile tightened. "Don't be dramatic, Everett. It's just a tree. Just a tree." I didn't say another word. I walked back toward the house, my hands practically shaking. That sycamore had been standing longer than most houses on this block. But more importantly, it was protected. I knew it was. I'd looked it up when I bought the place 4 years ago. The city had it registered as a heritage tree due to its age and the species. Cutting it down without a permit carried a minimum fine of $10,000 per tree, and Clorinda Goodman had just ordered it chopped in half without even knocking on my door. That night, I dug out the folder from the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the one labeled House Docs. Tucked between the property survey and the old inspection report was the certificate from the city's Department of Urban Forestry. Sure enough, the tree was listed by species, location, and even tagged with a serial code. The kicker? The document was co-signed by a city arborist. The fine print made it clear removal without city authorization was a code violation. I had everything I needed, and I wasn't going to waste a second. By Monday morning, I had already scheduled a meeting with the city's urban forestry compliance officer, a guy named Leon Martinez. He met me on site that afternoon, stepping out of his city-issue hybrid with a clipboard and a camera. Leon was the kind of civil servant who took his job seriously without taking himself too seriously. He walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the stump like it had insulted his mother. "Let me guess," he said, crouching down. "They didn't even file a removal request. Didn't knock. Didn't send a letter. Just showed up with chainsaws and an attitude." Leon grunted and snapped a few photos. "Clorinda Goodman, right?" I raised an eyebrow. "You know her? She's got a reputation. I've had complaints from 2 other neighborhoods she managed before this one. She likes to interpret discretion as dictatorship." He stood up, brushing bark dust off his pant leg. "This stump here? That's a Class B protected species. You said you had documentation?" I handed him the certificate. He studied it, nodded once, and tucked it into his folder. "That's all I need. I'll file an incident report with the city attorney. Since it was removed without a permit and without owner consent, the HOA is liable. Could be more than just a fine depending on how the council wants to play it." "More than a fine?" I asked. "If they contracted a removal without verifying permits, especially on a city-recognized tree, there's potential for a charge of negligent destruction of protected urban forestry." He looked back at the stump. "And if they bill you for it, that's fraud." I hadn't even thought of that. But when I checked my mailbox later that day, sure enough, there it was, a bright yellow HOA invoice for emergency vegetation hazard removal, totaling $875, due by the end of the month. That was all I needed. I photocopied the invoice, attached it to the complaint form Leon had left with me, and marched it straight over to the city council office. I didn't just want them fined, I wanted them exposed. The next week, the council called a public hearing. A notice went out to every homeowner in the neighborhood. Clorinda tried to downplay it, of course, sending out one of her glossy newsletters about routine governance oversight, but people were getting curious and angry. At the hearing, the room was packed. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months filled the metal chairs, whispering and eyeing the front row where Clorinda sat, arms folded, lips pursed like she'd swallowed a lemon. Next to her was the HOA's supposed legal counsel, a guy who looked more like a real estate agent than a lawyer. The city attorney introduced the case, then Leon took the stand. He laid out the facts with clinical precision, showing photos, citing municipal codes, and even playing a voice recording from a neighbor who had witnessed the removal from her upstairs window. Did they have a removal permit? The council chair asked. No, Leon replied. In fact, they bypassed the required application process entirely. No arborist inspection, no homeowner signature, no city review. Clorinda leaned forward. We believed it to be an imminent hazard. You believed, the chair cut in, without any documented evidence or professional evaluation? Clorinda opened her mouth, then closed it again. The city attorney stood up. Not only was this tree protected under municipal ordinance, but its removal was carried out in direct violation of that ordinance. The HOA appears to have ignored due process and misused funds to carry out unauthorized activity on private property. Then he held up the invoice. This was sent to Mr. Everett Doyle, the homeowner. It falsely claims the removal was both necessary and billable. That constitutes fraudulent billing. There was a ripple through the crowd. People were murmuring now, some shaking their heads. A few were glaring openly at Clorinda. That's when I stood up. With permission, I said, and the chair nodded. I'd like to add that this wasn't the first overstep by this HOA. It's just the first one that left a stump. But neighbors here have been fined for mailbox colors, told to remove bird feeders, and threatened for having service vehicles parked in their own driveways even when those vehicles were gone by nightfall. This isn't about tree roots. It's about control. And it's time we stop letting the control go unchecked. A smattering of applause broke out. Clorinda's lawyer leaned into her, whispering something, but she waved him off. The council deliberated briefly, then delivered their ruling. The HOA will be fined $10,000 for the unlawful removal of a protected tree and an additional $2,000 for fraudulent billing. The HOA president, Ms. Goodman, is hereby ordered to cease all discretionary vegetation removals pending a full audit. Furthermore, we're recommending a governance review to determine if the HOA board is operating within its legal boundaries. Clorinda stood up, her face pale. You can't do that. The chair looked at her calmly. We just did. After the hearing, people gathered outside the council building, buzzing with energy. Neighbors who barely waved to each other before were suddenly talking like old friends. They weren't just angry, they were inspired. Why didn't we do this sooner? Someone muttered. Because no one wanted to be the first one to push back, I said. That night, I got a knock on my door. It was my neighbor, Raj, from across the street. He worked nights at the hospital and rarely showed up at HOA meetings. You really shook things up today, he said, holding out a six-pack of craft beer. I've lived here 8 years, and I've never seen Clorinda shut up for that long. I laughed and stepped aside to let him in. We're starting a petition, he said, settling onto the porch swing, to call a special election for new board members. You in? I didn't even hesitate. Absolutely. Over the next few days, signatures poured in. Turns out plenty of folks had stories Clorinda fining them for minor issues, rewriting rules without votes, pushing her personal preferences as regulation. A retired postal worker down the street had been fined for excessive mailbox personalization because he'd painted a hummingbird on the side. A young couple was threatened with legal action for installing solar panels because they disrupted the uniform aesthetic. By the end of the week, we had enough signatures to trigger a board recall. Clorinda tried to block it, of course, claimed the signatures were invalid, that the timing violated a clause in the HOA's charter. But she had lost her grip. The city's ruling had made her vulnerable, and residents weren't afraid of her anymore. At the recall meeting, she didn't even show up. The vote was unanimous. 3 new board members were elected people who actually lived in the neighborhood, who had no interest in micromanaging bird feeders or cutting down trees for personal preference. The first order of business? Banning any future vegetation removals without a certified arborist report, homeowner consent, and city permit. The second? Issuing a formal apology to me, signed by the new board, and refunding every resident who had been fined under Clorinda's reign for infractions that didn't exist under the CC and RS. I framed the apology and hung it next to the certificate from the city, the one listing the sycamore's heritage status. The stump, by the way, didn't stay a stump for long. With the new board's blessing, a local nursery donated a young sycamore from the same lineage. It'll take time to grow, but it's in good hands. And this time, no one's bringing a chainsaw near it. 2 weeks after Clorinda's ousting, I was sitting in my backyard with a notepad in my lap and a glass of sweet tea sweating on the armrest. The new sycamore swayed gently in the breeze, barely taller than my mailbox, but already growing strong. I just finished jotting down notes for a neighborhood improvement proposal when a black SUV pulled into my driveway. This one didn't belong to Clorinda. 2 men stepped out, one in uniform, the other in a dark suit. The uniformed officer introduced himself as Detective Carson from the city's Property Crimes Division. The man in the suit was Assistant District Attorney Nolan Reyes. "Mr. Doyle," Reyes said, flipping open a leather folder. "We're following up on the tree incident. Mind if we talk inside?" The air shifted. I led them inside, offered chairs at the kitchen table, and closed the blinds. Reyes placed a stack of papers on the table. "You're not in trouble, but we've uncovered something far bigger than an unauthorized tree removal." Carson leaned forward. "We obtained internal HOA emails through a subpoena. Communication between Clorinda Goodman and a landscaping contractor named Rick Tolson. Does that name ring a bell?" I nodded. "He was the guy with the chainsaw." Reyes slid one of the printed emails toward me. "According to this and several others, Clorinda instructed Tolson to remove not just your sycamore, but 7 trees across the neighborhood over the past 18 months. Every one of them was on private property, and 4 were also on the city's protected list." Carson added, "She told Tolson to bill the HOA, then issued fraudulent fines to homeowners to recoup the cost. We're talking nearly $40,000 in misappropriated funds and unauthorized fines." My stomach tightened. She was funneling HOA money through fake citations? Reyes nodded. "And Tolson? He's not even licensed. He's under investigation for operating a business without certification and falsifying insurance documents." Carson placed a thin, sealed envelope in front of me. "We're here because your case gave us probable cause to dig. And it gets worse. We believe Clorinda was personally profiting from the arrangement. Tolson paid her a consulting fee on each job." My hands curled into fists. She was stripping the neighborhood like it was a salvage yard. Reyes leaned back. "We're preparing charges against her fraud, misuse of funds, destruction of protected property, and conspiracy. We may file wire fraud too, depending on how she processed the payments." Carson stood. "We'd like your permission to use your HOA invoice and the city's hearing transcript as part of the evidence package." "Absolutely," I said. "Anything you need." They left with my signed consent and a thumb drive containing digital copies of everything I had. As the door clicked shut behind them, I stared at the envelope they'd left. Inside was a formal notice of the investigation, along with a victim impact statement form. That night, I walked down the block to visit Margaret and Willis, an elderly couple who'd lived here since the Reagan administration. Their Japanese maple had vanished last spring. Clorinda claimed it was diseased. I knew something was fishy, Willis muttered as he read the notice under the porch light. "She never showed me a report. Just sent us a bill." Margaret shook her head. "We thought about moving. But this makes me want to stay and fight." The next day, I helped them file their impact statement. Then I walked 2 more blocks to see the Rodriguezes, whose Twin Oaks had been removed after an anonymous complaint about road obstruction. They'd never filed a complaint themselves. Turns out, Clorinda had. By Friday, the DA's office had over a dozen statements. They called me back to confirm the case was moving forward and that Clorinda had retained counsel but refused to cooperate. The following Monday, the neighborhood buzzed with talk of a search warrant being executed at Clorinda's house. I stayed out of the way, but from my window, I saw 2 agents removing boxes and a desktop computer tower. Her manicured lawn looked forgotten, grass creeping past regulation height. At the next HOA meeting, the new board president, a retired city planner named Denise Harlow, stood at the front of the clubhouse with her reading glasses perched low on her nose. "I'm going to be blunt," she said. "Our HOA was exploited. Funds were redirected in ways that violated our bylaws, state law, and basic ethics. We're cooperating with the authorities, but we're also taking action here internally." She held up a thick stack of papers. "All fines issued over the past 2 years are under audit. Anyone who was billed by Clorinda's administration will have their situation reviewed. Expect letters in the next 2 weeks." People clapped, but Denise wasn't finished. We're also implementing new oversight protocols. Financial disbursements over $2,000 will require a public vote. Landscaping decisions? Same. And we're hiring a certified arborist to assess any removal request period. After the meeting, I stepped outside and found Nolan Reyes waiting by a parked sedan. "We found something in Clorinda's files you should see," he said, handing me a folder. Inside was a photocopy of a handwritten list. My address was third from the top, circled in red ink. Beside it, scrawled in all caps, "Remove Sycamore Blocks View." "She kept a hit list," I muttered. "She called it a visibility enhancement plan," Reyes said. "We found it in a drawer with HOA stationery and a half-dozen uncashed checks from Tolson." "Unreal," I said. "Not for long," Reyes replied. "The grand jury's convening next month. Charges will be filed before then." By the end of the week, Clorinda was formally arrested and charged. The local news picked it up when someone probably from the station got their hands on the grand jury filing. They ran her mugshot alongside a headline that read, "HOA President Indicted in Suburban Forestry Fraud." The photo didn't flatter her. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail. Not from the city, not from the HOA, but from a man named Barry Qualls. He introduced himself as the son of the original owner of my house, the one who planted the sycamore nearly half a century ago. He'd seen the story online and wanted to thank me for protecting it, even in spirit. He enclosed a photo, a black and white snapshot of the tree, no taller than a lamppost, with a grinning man in flared jeans standing beside it. "My dad called it the anchor," Barry had written. "Said he planted it to keep the house from ever feeling like it could drift away." I framed the photo and hung it in the hallway, just across from the front door. Every time I passed it, I remembered what it meant to stand your ground even when it felt like you were standing alone. Except I wasn't alone anymore. The neighborhood had changed. People waved more. Conversations lasted longer. The next block over, someone organized a Saturday morning cleanup crew. Someone else started a weekly garden swap. And for the first time in a long while, people weren't afraid to ask questions or challenge authority when something didn't sit right. The HOA's new board held monthly open forums. Denise made sure every decision was posted publicly, and every expenditure came with a receipt. The budget was no longer a mystery. Neither were the rules. And that sycamore? The young one we planted? It was growing fast. This time, we were growing with it. A month after Clorinda's arrest, a new rhythm had settled over the neighborhood, not quiet, exactly, but steady. The tension that used to hang in the air like static had dissipated. People were no longer walking on eggshells every time they rolled their trash bins out or left a porch light on past 10. The HOA meetings, once a formality dominated by Clorinda's iron grip, had turned into actual discussions. I'd never intended to join the board, but Denise asked me to consider a role as a community liaison, someone who'd gather concerns and relay them in a structured way without all the legalese that usually shut people down. I accepted, mostly because I wanted to make sure what happened to me never happened to anyone else. One Wednesday afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, expecting a survey or robocall. "This is Officer Dorian Peters with the State Financial Crimes Task Force," the voice said, professional, clipped. "Are you Everett Doyle?" "Yes, I am. You're listed as a primary witness in the ongoing investigation involving Clorinda Goodman. We've uncovered additional financial irregularities and would like to ask you a few questions in person." "Is this about the landscaping contractor?" "No, Mr. Doyle. This is something else entirely." We arranged to meet at the task force's downtown office the next morning. The building was a squat, gray complex with narrow windows and a keypad entry. Inside, Peters greeted me with a firm nod and led me through a maze of corridors to a small conference room already occupied by two analysts and a woman in a navy blazer who introduced herself as ADA Colleen Myers. She didn't waste time. "Mr. Doyle, over the past 6 weeks, we've been reviewing the HOA's financial ledgers. These records were turned over by the interim board and cross-referenced with subpoenaed bank statements. What we've found is a pattern of unauthorized fund transfers, many of which were disguised as payments to non-existent service vendors." She pushed a folder across the table. I opened it to find spreadsheets, payment records, and a list of shell companies. Most had generic names like Civic Ground Solutions and Urban Maintenance Group, LLC. "These companies don't exist," she continued. We've confirmed no business licenses, no tax records, and no actual services rendered. However, we tracked the payments through a series of accounts that ultimately point back to a personal checking account belonging to Clorinda Goodman's cousin, Robert Langley. Peters took over. Langley has a minor criminal record, mostly fraud and wire misrepresentation. Nothing recent, but enough to raise red flags. We believe Clorinda used him as a proxy to siphon HOA dues into personal holdings over a 2-year period. I leaned back in my chair, stunned. How much? Roughly $138,000, Myers said. I steady. And that's just what we've confirmed so far. There could be more hidden in longer-term maintenance contracts. Why me? I asked. Why bring me in for this part? Peters pointed to a line item labeled Tree Emergency Mitigation Doyle Property, dated 3 weeks before the sycamore's removal. This was the first payment tied to a non-existent vendor. It was the trigger that made our software flag the report. You were the catalyst. I nodded slowly. So, what now? We're expanding the case, Myers said. Clorinda's facing additional charges: grand theft, criminal conspiracy, and money laundering. Langley was arrested this morning in Nevada. He was using one of the fake vendor names to apply for a business loan. Peters added, "We'll need your testimony again. This time in Superior Court." The trial began 2 months later. It was held in a larger courthouse, with a full jury and press attendance. Clorinda looked different, tired, thinner, her hair pulled back in a plain bun. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. Her lawyer argued that she was misled by Langley, that she believed the vendors were legitimate. But the evidence was overwhelming. Email chains, bank transfers, and even a voice memo Langley had saved where she instructed him to invoice the HOA before the end of the quarter so the books stay clean. I testified on the second day. The prosecutor asked me to walk through the entire ordeal from the tree removal to the discovery of the protected status to the fake invoice and the city council hearing. I stuck to the facts. The jury watched in silence. When Myers played the recording of Clorinda's voice, the courtroom shifted. Even the defense attorney looked like the wind had been knocked out of him. The judge allowed the memo into evidence, and from that moment, the tone of the trial changed. 3 days later, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Clorinda was sentenced to 6 years in state prison, with an additional 5 years probation and a restitution order requiring her to pay back the stolen funds. Langley accepted a plea deal and agreed to testify against her in exchange for a reduced sentence. The neighborhood responded with a mix of relief and disbelief. Some people had never liked her, but few imagined she'd been running a small-scale embezzlement ring under the guise of neighborhood beautification. The new board restructured the HOA's financial oversight entirely. All expenditures now required third-party verification, and an independent audit firm was retained to review the books quarterly. As for the money Clorinda had stolen, most of it was frozen in Langley's accounts and seized by the state. The restitution fund was used to repair the damage she'd caused replacing trees, refunding illegal fines, and rebuilding trust. One Saturday, I was helping plant a new dogwood on the corner lot where an elderly couple lived. Their previous tree had been removed a year earlier, supposedly due to shade encroachment. As I packed the soil around the roots, Denise walked up with a clipboard and a tired smile. "We're naming the new community garden after your tree," she said. "We're calling it Anchor Grove." I paused. "You serious?" She nodded. "You gave this neighborhood its backbone back." The garden went up that summer: raised beds, native plants, benches donated by residents. Someone painted a mural on the back wall of the clubhouse, a towering sycamore, its branches stretching wide, leaves catching the light. We held our first harvest celebration in October. There were tables of homegrown vegetables, pies, and music from a local jazz trio. Kids ran between the garden beds, and neighbors swapped recipes and stories. No one mentioned Clorinda. There was no need. The legacy she tried to leave was buried beneath the roots of something stronger, something growing. The HOA no longer felt like a shadow overhead. It felt like what it was supposed to be: a group of people looking out for each other, not looking for ways to control each other. As the sun dipped low that evening, I stood beneath the young sycamore in my front yard, its leaves just beginning to turn. I thought about what it had taken to get here: the hearings, the trial, the long hours of paperwork and meetings and digging, both literal and figurative. It was worth it, not just for the tree, but for everything it came to represent.